Power of the Ruach HaKodesh. What do we know? Tonight, we're going to discuss the protocols of the A'rama'thean Remnant, a study in the theological practices of the remnant in the British Isles. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on another edition of Sefer Moments. I'm Stephen Pidgeon, and we're going to be discussing some of the nuances found in Scripture, particularly as set forth in the Sefer Millennium edition. Tonight's topic will be centered around these protocols of the A'rama'thean Remnant. And while we talk about this, we're going to be getting into this in quite some detail. We're going to be beginning with the preamble, of course. But I want to welcome everybody to our program here tonight. I want to thank you for all being here. And thank you, subscribers, for being a part of this ministry. Remember, if you want to engage in the live chat, you need to be a subscriber. You need to be a subscriber to chat live. See, that wasn't exactly a repetition, but rather a retrograde inversion of the same statement. Oh, yes. Anyway, thanks, guys, for being here. And our discussion tonight is, I think you're going to find it interesting. I'm hoping you are. There's going to be some things that are going to be, I think, shocking. And I want to present this particular review for people who have not been to this channel before, who are interested in discovering what it is we're talking about. So with that being said, I don't want to belabor the topic without getting to the point. Okay, I know how I get frustrated listening to videos where they keep ranting and raving, and it's like, hey, could you get on with it here and and stop messing around? All right, hold on just 1 second here. Okay, now here we go. All right, now let's see if we can share this screen, and we'll get going. All right. The protocols of the A'rama'thean Remnant. All right. Now, of course, we're going to be dealing with scriptures taken from the Sefer Millennium edition, although not exclusively tonight, because we're going to be looking at some other scriptures, some scriptures as found in the book Ha'avot. Ha'avot, The Fathers is the name of the book. We publish it at Sefer Publishing Group. It's part of our library. And we're going to be dealing with the extraordinary book of the Gospel of Nicodemus, also called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. Now, there's three really pieces of information that can be gleaned for a student of this particular gospel. And one is, of course, the Acts of Pontius Pilate, the Gospel of Nicodemus. The other is the article volume, a letter to the Senate from Pontius Pilate himself. And then, of course, there is the letter of Pontius Pilate's wife in respect of what she witnessed. All three of these things are three witnesses to the last days of Mashiach, if you will. And of course, our foundation is going to be coming from the Sefer. We're going to be taking a look at some other scriptures as well, other protocols in scripture from other editions. And we'll be talking about that a little bit. But as you know, we have just recently released the Flexibind version of the Sefer, a Flexibind version, gold leaf on pages, double ribbon, and large point font, and a much reduced book size. It's 1/3 smaller than the book that you had before, at least in its thickness, than the large print you had before. And it is 3.5 pounds lighter, almost half the weight. So it's a very manageable book. You can carry it in one hand. It opens up easily and you can keep your place with no problem. Yes, you can get it with tabs. That's an important part of that. Okay, and it is available now. There is no wait to get it, although there is a limited printing. So when this printing is exhausted, then it's going to be a wait before we get the next printing. So take advantage of it while it's here, if you will. All right. As you know, the Sefer transliterates the hallowed name of Yahweh, plus 3,100 other names found in the Greek text, and includes the Nan Makaf Aleph Tav, as well as many other translation differences from the average scripture. We're going to be dealing with some of those tonight. Let's get into it. Stop talking and let's get into it. Preamble. One of the great tenets of misinformation that has been given to the Christian world over the centuries has to do with the fatal flaw found in almost all New Testament translations. A contradiction so deadly as to destroy the credibility of the entire narrative. Ironically, this fatal flaw is found in the very first chapter of the New Testament, and in the manner currently accepted, no link can be established between the Messiah, Mashiach, and David. Notwithstanding the fact that the two blind who are healed inside of the two different gospels each cry out, Son of David, come and help, Son of David, Son of David. And Peter lectures the Yahudim in the second chapter of the book of Acts, Ma'assim, and says, you who crucified the Son of David. Well, the Son of David. Well, really, can you demonstrate that in your average book of Scripture? And the answer is no, you cannot. Most people do not look at this particular passage of Scripture because they get so bored with the word begat in Matthew 1 that they fall asleep and pass out, and otherwise don't read the entirety of that chapter. But it is worth taking the time to review that chapter to see, because when you get into 117, it says there are 42 generations from Abraham to David. Abraham to Mashiach, 14 from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the taken away to Babylon, and 14 from there to Messiah. But when you read it, you will see that you cannot count Miryam in that count. Why can't you count Miryam in that count? Because she is touted as the wife of Joseph in that count, and the DNA does not go from husband to wife such that you articulate a new count. That's not a generation. That's the same generation. There's other women mentioned in Matthew 1. There's Bathsheba that's mentioned there. There is Ruth that's mentioned there, the Moabite. There's Rahab, the prostitute. There's even a reference to Tamar, the mother of the twins, Peretz. So you can see that when you have these other women, they're not counted in the litany. None of the other wives are counted in the litany. And so you cannot count Miryam. And you end up with 14, 14, and 13. And because of that, you cannot link Mashiach to David. If you're talking about Joseph, the husband of Mary, then there is no link between Mashiach and David, because Luke 3 tells us that Joseph, as was supposed, was his father, but not really his father, because both Matthew and Luke tell us that Mashiach was conceived by the Ruach HaKodesh and not by another person. Okay, so who's lying here? Who's got it wrong? What's the mistake? What's happening here? We have this contradiction, that we have this failure to connect Mashiach to David. What is this failure? Why is this happening? Well, this is something that when it's unearthed is going to reveal something. One of the wealthiest men in the ancient world was also a son of David, an ex-Ilarch king of Yahud, who stood in the direct lineage and who was widely respected not only in Rome, where he held a seat in the Roman Senate, but also in Judea, where he held a seat on the Council of the Sanhedrin. The Gospel of Mark calls him, quote, an honorable counselor, and the underlying Greek tells us he sat at the Sanhedrin. Referred to by the acronym JOA, the title belies an obvious truth when you see it. He is not from A'rama'thea, he is A'rama'thea, meaning first, Aleph, in the divine line, Thea, of high places, Rama. Of Thea being G2 2316, high places, Rama, H 7413. His name alone, when properly understood, tells you that Joseph, who is referenced in Matthew 1:6, is actually Yoceph A'rama'thea, who is the father of Miryam and not the husband of Miryam. The father of Miryam and not the husband of Miryam. The husband of Miryam was a different Joseph altogether. The correction required in Matthew 1, which, by the way, renders the count 14, 14, and 14 as demanded by Matthew 1:17, discusses the father of Miryam, not the husband, whose distinct lineage is set forth in Luke 3. And it is distinct and widely disparate from the lineage in Matthew. In fact, you'll see that Joseph in Luke 3 is a descendant of Nathan, the son of David. And there are actually 70 generations listed there from Hanok to Joseph. where there are only 42 generations listed from Abraham to Mashiach in Matthew 1. And the names are quite different throughout the whole transaction. So you can see clearly that is one genealogy in Luke 3 and a completely different genealogy in Matthew 1. They cannot be the same person. The supposed father of Yoceph was also the husband of Miryam, but it cannot possibly be the same person in both lineages because they're so distinct. When you understand that Matthew 1 is talking about the father of Miryam, all of these things are cured, and suddenly you have proof that Mashiach is in the line of David. Now, the word at issue here is the word aner. And aner is a primary word meaning a man, properly as an individual male, a fellow, a husband, a man, or a sir. And this comes from or is related to the word anthropos. And you might remember the word anthropomorphology, anthropogenic, man caused, right? And this comes from the Greek word anthropos, meaning man faced, i.e., a human being, a certain man. Now, normally you might ask yourself the question, well, this is quite interesting because we know that really the term husband does not appear in scripture unless you want to construe the word Baali as husband, which is possible to do. It's certainly the modern usage of the term Baali. However, typically we find that when you're talking about Ish and Isha, and the word wife does not appear in either the Greek or the Hebrew, nor does the word husband, although the word husbandman, a farmer, does appear. And so we see here that when you're talking about husband, this is a construction that says, okay, her man, therefore he must have been her husband. But by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, but Mashiach had already, had already resurrected and had already ascended. And when you look at the Gospels, all four Gospels, the last appearance we see of Joseph, the supposed father of Mashiach, is when he's 12 years old and they leave him behind in Jerusalem. After that, you don't see him at all. There's no reference to him whatsoever, saving maybe the passage that when a disciple comes to him and says, I'd like to come and follow you, but I need to go bury my father. And he says to him, let the dead bury the dead. Was that one of Mashiach's brothers that had said that to him in respect of the death of Yoceph? We don't know because the New Testament is full of deletions in terms of telling us who's who got married where the water was turned to wine, who was the disciple that had to bury his father, etc. A lot of names that could be disclosed. What was the name of Peter's mother-in-law? Lots of names that could have been disclosed, but were not disclosed, at least not in the New Testament. Names redacted to protect the innocent. Okay, so as a consequence, under the Torah, and there is reference, by the way, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, that all of the family of Mashiach were Torah observant. This is what's spelled out in the Gospel of Nicodemus, that they were Torah observant and had a reputation for being Torah observant. So under the Torah, when a woman who is married, when her husband dies and she's still young, not yet an official widow at 60 years old or older, but rather is younger than that, that she would come back under the guardianship of her father. There is another interesting gospel out there called the Gospel of Ya'aqov that details the life of Miryam. And it's very interesting because according to this Gospel of Ya'aqov, her father Yoceph, a very wealthy man, although they tried to disguise him, calling him Joachim, but Yoceph, a very wealthy man, gave their daughter up. His wife was barren. When she finally got pregnant, they nursed the daughter until she was 2 years old, and then they gave the daughter to the temple, and she was reared at the temple as a temple virgin, if you will. So she was not under the care of her father, but afterwards she was married. And by the way, it was a huge disgrace to the temple for her to become pregnant before she was married. So once this marriage was essentially accomplished between her and Yoceph, and they went along with their life, when her husband died, there was not going to be any returning to the temple. She instead returned to the guardianship of her father, who would be known as her man, as her fellow. And so this would mean that this word aner could equally apply to her father under those circumstances. Okay. Bearing in mind here that the account of Matthew is written after the death and resurrection during the course of the adult ministry of Mashiach, there is no reference to Yoceph, as was supposed, his father, Luke 3:23. Although scripture is silent, he likely predeceased Mashiach by many years. Therefore, the cover of Miryam in Torah would have reverted to her father, Yoceph A'rama'thea. We will briefly discuss here recent scholarship, which shows that Yoceph A'rama'thea was also known as Yosef ben Gurion, the old man. He is rumored to have lived to the age of 111 years, being born in 67 BC and having a date of death cited at Glastonbury in AD 45. It is also reasoned that he may have been the father of Nicodemus, Nakdimon ben Gurion, the son of the old man. Well, isn't that interesting? Okay. Now, you might recall that these two worked together to retrieve the body of Mashiach following the crucifixion, as Mashiach would be Nicodemus's nephew and Yoceph A'rama'thea's grandson. It is an important distinction, as some historians claim, Yoceph A'rama'thea was the great uncle, and others that he was the father. We hold to the minor correction in the word aner. In other words, we're using Occam's razor to make the least amount of correction possible, given the text. The great uncle language and so on and so forth comes from much later literature, Gnostic literature, if you will, to try to claim that he was an uncle. After being persecuted by the Sanhedrin and interrogated by the Romans following the mysterious resurrection, Yoceph A'rama'thea would leave Judea for the British Isles, where he was the supervisor of the tin and copper mining trade, according to Roman record. It is rumored that he had also fathered a son, although he may have been a grandson, and one of the 4 children of Miryam, named Josephus. All right, boom. Now look at this. This is going to be very interesting. Much of this is discussed in an essay written by Rian Buyson, written on the 19th of November, 2014, and published online for Barbelo at the following web address, and you can see it there. Okay. Miryam had other children. Oh, no, that can't be right. Well, it's in the Gospels, and it's very clear that Miryam had other children. So let's talk about these other children and who they were and how they are named in Scripture. And when the Shabbat had come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, "From where has this man learned these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Miryam, and the brother of Ya'aqov and Yoceph and Yehuda and Shimon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended by him. Very interesting, huh? So here's the brothers right here, right? Ya'aqov, Yoceph, Yehuda, and Shimon. So when we look at this verse closer, let's see who we're talking about. Well, here, Ya'aqov would be known as Ya'aqov Tsaddiq, or James the Just, the book of James being written by him. Yoceph, Josephus, the famous historian. Yehuda would be known both as Jude, the author of the book of Jude in the New Testament, and Thaddeus, the disciple. Was Shimon the Zealot? Also possible, Shimon the Zealot. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem, a Shabbat's day's journey. And when they had come in, they went up into an upper room where both Kepha and Yaakov abode, and Yochanan and Andre, Philip and Taom, the twin, Bartelmai and Matithyahu, Yaakov Alphaios, and Shimon the Zealot, and Yehuda, the brother of Yaakov. So here we see that you have Yaakov, Shimon, and Yehuda listed last. That appears to be the order by which the family members of Mashiach throughout the Gospels are going to be listed last when they appear. This Yaakov, who appears up here with Kepha, is, according to the Gospel of Nicodemus, is actually beheaded by Herod the Tetrarch, who then arrests Kepha with the intention of beheading him as well. But the Ya'aqov Tsaddiq, well, we'll get to that when we get there. All right. So we also see in Mark 6:3, are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended by him. Although the sisters are not named, there are at least two sisters because the word sisters is used, plural. It is speculated that their names were Salome and Mary or Miryam. And here we see in Mark 15, verses 40 through 41, there were also women looking on from afar, among whom was Miryam of Migdal, and Miryam, the mother of Ya'aqov the Lesser, and of Yoceph and Salome. Now, when you see this phrase, Ya'aqov the Lesser, a better way to understand this would be Ya'aqov the Humble, Ya'aqov the Meek, Ya'aqov, not the arrogant. That's a better way to understand that particular word that appears there. But we see Miryam of Migdal, Miryam, the mother of Ya'aqov the Lesser, that would be also the mother of Mashiach, and Yoceph and Salome. So again, we see the family members are being listed last. Miryam the mother, Ya'aqov, Yoceph, and Salome, who also, when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered to him, and many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. Ya'aqov, James, Yoceph, Josephus, and Salome. The family is reckoned last. The narrative developed in Britain by the great historians Alan Wilson, deceased, and Barham Blackett, deceased, assessed that Yoceph A'rama'thea arrived in Britain around AD 35 to 36 to stay, and that a first century center was established in Glamorgan, which is now Llandaff Major in Wales. In addition, they reasoned that his grave is found in the Blackfriar Abbey, just behind the ancient Cardiff Castle in Cardiff, Wales. Now, I've been at that site, and it's incredible because Alan Wilson said that that site was the site of intense pilgrimage for 400 years, from the 1st century until the 4th century, or the 5th century. They were coming to the grave of Yoceph A'rama'thea at that particular site. And after that, there was different things that happened. There was a different bishop that was buried there and so on. Then eventually that abbey was burned by Henry VIII. And all that remains is just a foundation that was laid in place of the foundation that was there by the city fathers. They did not take the graves out, but they paved over with concrete whatever tombstone was there at the grave of Yoceph A'rama'thea. What few records there are propose that Yoceph of A'rama'thea was granted 12 hides of land for the 12 disciples he had brought to the British Isles with him, establishing a written record that he was there and that land had transacted. Where this land was remains a mystery, as there is debate between the medieval legends around Glastonbury, which is mostly Templar derived, Knights Templar, the longer standing culture of Cornwall, which goes back to really long-standing phrases, long-standing slogans, long-standing songs, traditions that go back to the tin mines, that go all the way back to the 1st century, particularly the Ding Dong mine, which had a history going back before the 1st century, in fact, hundreds of years before the 1st century. And the Cornwall traditions are quite compelling in terms of their narrative, and more importantly, the geography of Cornwall is really quite compelling in terms of some of the things you can see there. Like, for instance, the island of Marazion really gives a very clear idea of the kind of treachery that was engaged in traveling by ship. Now, some of the writers have looked at Cornwall and said, well, look, when you see that Mashiach was a carpenter, there wasn't a lot of carpentry going on in the Middle East or, in Levant during the time of Mashiach. I mean, this is basically a place where the homes are built out of rock and, and limestone and so forth. So, I mean, I'm sure they had some carpentry happening, but it's more likely that Mashiach was a ship's carpenter. And the record in Cornwall talks about him arriving as a boy and that he'd made many trips into Cornwall, may have actually built a house in Cornwall. And there's a discussion about him and Yoceph A'rama'thea being stranded on the island of Mara-Zion for 3 months. And this happened because Mara-Zion is a very interesting island. It now has, to give you an example of the importance of Mara-Zion, it has the Chapel of St. Michael on this island. And that Chapel of St. Michael lines up with Chateau Saint Michel and a number of other St. Michael chapels all the way back to Jerusalem in a direct ley line. Now, I'm not sure how they did that because they certainly didn't have Zeppelins or aircraft or GPS monitors to be able to put them in all those places, but they are in a direct line. And in addition to that, so Mara-Zion has this interesting anomaly where there is, the way they have prepared it now is there is a brick pathway that they have laid down bricks that runs from the mainland across this beach to the island. And it is such that at the low tide, you can walk right over there. But then the tide comes in and it comes in pretty quickly. And, you know, it comes in quick enough where if you have started on the path and you only see a little bit of water in the middle of the path, you'd better hustle because that path will be covered with water deep to requiring you to swim to get to the other side. And by the time it arrives at high tide, the path is completely obliterated. You can't see it at all. And so the story goes that the tide never receded enough for them to walk off the island for 3 months. And so they were on this island, Mara-Zion, for 3 months. And there's many, many sayings, minor sayings and blessings and so on that talk about Yoceph the Tin Man, that also talk about the Mashiach being there. There's a well that they point to. There's ancient villages that still survive. There's some ancient statuary, for instance, that shows Mashiach as a young child on the cross, right? And so there's just many, many features in Cornwall that lend credence to the idea that, in fact, Yoceph A'rama'thea was there with Mashiach as a young man and may have been there, or may have been back and forth on the ship trade, back and forth from Egypt, from the Levant, all the way into the British Isles and the tin trade, back and forth continually from the time Mashiach was 12 or 13 until he began his ministry at nearly the age of 30. So this puts him 14, 15 years back and forth to the British Isles and back and forth to this area. The other historians actually weigh in and say that A'rama'thea was actually married to a woman named Hannah, who was born, in fact, in Cornwall. And so A'rama'thea may have had a separate house in Cornwall, and so, or somewhere in the British Isles. So when the time came for him to leave Judea, which you're talking about somebody who was on the Roman Senate, who was in the Sanhedrin, in Judea, he was a well-placed man, very wealthy man, one of the most wealthy men in the world. Did he have a second house? Very likely. May have had more than that. But the only thing that compelled him to move from Cornwall to somewhere else was the fact that he was given these 12 hides of land. And so he may have moved onto those lands. However, when we talk about the legend that goes around Glastonbury, this legend is not, in my opinion, a great legend. There's not a lot of architecture to support it. There is nothing that precedes the 9th century at Glastonbury. And when you go to Glastonbury, you know, this is in the Somerset area of Britain. Most of Somerset, I believe, was swamp and underwater during the time of A'rama'thea, although it may not have been, but it appears that it very well could have been. And the Tor, which is the hill that overlooks Glastonbury, did not have its tower on it until the 9th century. Now, there may have been an ancient church on top of the Tor that had been built there prior. That's what the legend says. But when you look at some of the legend practices at Glastonbury, some of them are ludicrous. For instance, the story of King Arthur and Guinevere and their graves supposedly being located at Glastonbury is simply not true. It was made up in order to cause pilgrims to come into Glastonbury so that they could rebuild the roof on the abbey. And one of the things that you see when you get to Glastonbury is that the abbey was enormous. The grounds are enormous. The abbey was enormous. And they had many other buildings there as well. And they were, Henry VIII is the one who finally put the end to it. He burned the place to the ground and actually hung the bishop because the bishop was arrogant and in rebellion to Henry VIII, and Henry VIII put an end to him. So there's credibility issues that are associated with Glastonbury. Much fewer credibility issues when you get into Cornwall, because you have to remember that when you talk about the ancient mythology of terms of the visitations of Mashiach, there's only two other myths that discuss, well, there's a third one if you talk about the Mormon record. But when you talk about the idea of Mashiach in India or Mashiach in Japan, these are the other two competing myths that say that Mashiach came to them at some point. Both of the myths in both India and in Japan are mythologies that say he did not die on the cross and then came and lived out his life in Japan or lived out his life in Tibet. And most of that is Islamic narrative. It's Islamic narrative. The idea that his twin brother died on the cross and that he went forward and lived out his life in these places. That's an Islamic narrative, which means that most of that narrative was prepared probably after the 7th century. And so that's the basis for that. There is no other place on earth that claims that he was present as a child, as a young man in that place, but Cornwall. That's the only place that makes that claim. And the claim has been buttressed with just all kinds of, well, the best way to put it is ancient tradition that has never been reversed. In other words, ancient songs, ancient verse, ancient sayings, ancient comments that all make these references to Yoceph A'rama'thea and the Mashiach as a child being present in Cornwall. Okay. All right. Now, when we talk about, let's talk about Cardiff. Now, Cardiff may have, and when I spoke with Ross Broadstock, and may he rest in peace, and may his wife and family be blessed by the hand of Yah directly. But when I spoke with Ross, Ross and I were very good friends, and we spent a long time at that grave of Yoceph A'rama'thea in Cardiff. We did an hour and a half video with good brother Shane Stokes, very good friend of mine, who I greatly admire. And Shane and I were talking about this, and Ross and I were talking about this, and about the question of whether or not these 12 hides of land had been granted near Cardiff, or were they elsewhere? And of course, on this last trip that I made into Britain, I had the opportunity to go to the island of Anglesey. Now, Anglesey has its own mythology. Well, let's get to that. Let's talk about that. Let's see what we have. Maybe I've got something we can look at. So the Edict of Tiberius in AD 51 appears to have targeted Yoceph A'rama'thea, particularly, and also sought to eradicate the Brehon judges called Druids, or planted oaks. Now, the Brehons were, the story goes, and this is by the way, this is a story that is well related by Charles A.L. Totten. And if you can read his exhaustive writings, Charles A.L. Totten discusses this history in Ireland in particular, and hones in on what took place with the arrival of Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah, around 581 BC, and who arrived with Baruch, that in the Irish they call Brug, but was Baruch, and he was there with Tefi, or Tamar, the daughter of Zedekiah. And Tamar would come in and she would marry Ya'aqov the Hermon, Ya'aqov the Hermon being the first of the Milesian kings to take the throne in Ireland, a direct descendant of the house of Zerach, the firstborn of Judah. And when she came in and Yirmiyahu came in, Charles A.L. Totten relates that he believes that Yirmiyahu arrived with the Ark of the Covenant. And when he arrived with the Ark of the Covenant was placed on the ground in Ireland, which the power and the authority of the Ark chased all the snakes off Ireland, for which St. Patrick 1,000 years later would take credit. But the snakes were actually chased off Ireland by the Ark of the Covenant being set on the ground. And this Ark of the Covenant now would cause, under the literature given to us in Jeremiah chapter 1, Jeremiah would see the witness of the destruction of the old Jerusalem and the planting of the new Jerusalem, which, according to this legend, was planted at Tara in Ireland. Tara, named after the Torah, of course. And the priesthood at that time were worshippers of Baal and were worshippers of the serpent. Okay, that's not really a surprise, given the fact that Moshe held himself out under the authority of a serpent. And they gave up the worship of the serpent when the serpents were all chased off the island of Ireland with the placing of the Ark of the Covenant, and immediately embraced the Torah that had been brought in by Yirmiyahu. And so Yirmiyahu explained the Torah, and Tamar would be a daughter of the Torah who brought the Torah into Ireland. And this would plant the foundation, if you will, the planting of righteousness that's discussed in Yeshayahu 61. This planting of righteousness would be planted, and this would become the planting of the foundations of the common law that would now spring up among the British Isles. And it sprung from this source. So the Druids, who had been practicing Baal worship and serpent worship, abandoned that, repented from their position, and began to administer the Torah as judges or Brehan. And the Brehan would then apply the Torah of Moshe to establish the common law in Ireland under the High Irish Kings. And the High Irish Kings were those who had the scepter in their hand and a lawgiver between their feet, as was prophesied in Genesis 49, would be the condition of Judah. Now, you have to keep in mind that when you go back to the story of Tamar, and you talk about Tamar and the birth of both Peretz and Zerach. Zerach was born with a red ribbon around his hand. He was the first to break the matrix. By the Torah, he was the first to break the matrix. He was therefore the firstborn. The red ribbon was put around his hand to substantiate that. And then Peretz came out, and Peretz literally means the breach be upon you. And so because this is the situation, this would result in Zerach being singled out as the scapegoat and cast into the wilderness. He had the red ribbon of the Azazel goat cast into the wilderness, whereas Peretz would be ultimately the lamb of Elohim who would be sacrificed for the sins of the world. It would be a son, a direct descendant of Peretz in Mashiach, that would be sacrificed for the sins of the world. Okay, so interesting. So when you see the line of kings that is David, because David had such a heart for Yah says there will always be a king on the throne of David forever and ever. Well, what happened to this? Well, that kingdom came to a complete end in Zedekiah. And it was said, and this is the end of, I believe it's in Chronicles, that says, you will never have a king sitting on the throne in Yahud again, in the line of David. There will not be a king in the line of David sitting on the throne of Yahud. But that did not foreclose the possibility of the line of kings and the line of David from sitting on the throne elsewhere in the replanting of righteousness in a second Jerusalem. So this likely happened at Tara Hill. Jerusalem was replanted, the Torah was replanted, and the line of David in the house of Peretz was in the seed of the woman, was married to the line of Zerach, who held the true birthright of the scepter in the hand and the lawgiver between his feet. So as a consequence, this marriage then created a unity between the two houses and a true line of David ruling outside of Yahud would then begin to maintain the throne of David in perpetuity. When you look at what happens with Mashiach, Mashiach being the Lamb of Elohim, takes a kingdom that is not of this world in perpetuity. He remains a living king of a kingdom that is in heaven, a kingdom not on earth. This is what he tells Pilate. My kingdom is not from here. If my kingdom were, I would call it angels to slaughter all you. But I am not from here. My kingdom is of another place. And Pilate said, well, okay, we can't talk about this anymore. All right. So the Brehon, these Brehon judges, had really a substantial reputation throughout the world. Their adjudication and their mediation was very well respected throughout all of Europe, and in fact reached as far as India. It is said that even Pythagoras was instructed in geometry by Druids, by a Druid named Abrasus. And so you can see that this teaching and the qualifications for the brehon, which would be an archdruid, was substantial. They had to know the entirety of the Torah. They had to know all of astronomy. They had to know music theory. They had to know philosophy. They had to know botany. They had to know geometry. They had to know all these things very, very well to be the archdruid. And they had to be able to recite these things from memory and to give them to you in what's called triadic expression. 3 ideas to give you a triad and to otherwise summarize what is going to happen in a given trial. These brehon were very well respected throughout all of Europe. Rome knew that. Rome knew that they were competing with a system that was far superior to the Justinian Code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and all of the other writings that had been accumulated in really the corrupted, secular, paganized, polytheist state that was Rome. Whether it was a republic or whether it was the empire, it was nonetheless polytheist, full of idolatry, full of pagan rituals and heathen practices that had been melded into a hodgepodge. They didn't understand any of it anyway, and had incorporated all these various doctrines and ideas that just came into the culture saying it's important for us to embrace diversity, equity, and equality in the gods that we bring into Rome. And so as a result, they had created a pragmatically working system, but it could not compete with the ideology of the common law and the teaching of the Druids and the practices of the brehon. As a consequence, Tiberius said, you know what? I'm getting sick and tired of these guys always having a better argument than what we have. You get up there and kill that Yoceph A'rama'thea and kill all those Druids. Get rid of them. He also wanted to eradicate the brehon judges called Druids. A massacre was planned and executed at Bangor. And Bangor, of course, is an ancient name for stone circles. And these stone circles were a common practice of the Druids or the brehon. And in these stone circles, you would have 12 stones set in an algorithmic expression that approximated the 19-year justification between the sun and the moon cycle in exactness. And these, in addition to that, these 12 stones, all unhewn stones, typically set under an oak tree, consistent with the last chapter of the book of Joshua, these stones were capable of telling you what day of the week it was, what time of the day it was, what season it was, what month of the year it was, if you could understand the shadows that were cast by the 12 stones. Now, in addition to that, there were 2 stones inside the circle. There was what was called the rocking stone, and there was the Logan stone. And the Logan stone would be a place where you would deposit your gift or your offering, or you maybe had to pay for the service. And then the rocking stone is where the brehon would stand. And when he was talking to you, he would lean forward and the stone would rock forward and he'd speak to the people and make his sentence. And then when it came time to listen, he would sit back and the stone would rock back. And then he would take that as an opportunity to give audience to the arguments that were being made. This was the common practice of what was called the Bangor. And there was a town that has since been named Bangor because this was the last bastion of the Druids who had been persecuted by the Romans for some time. The wives and the children of these Druids and all of these Druids were brutally slaughtered by the Romans in AD 56. This lifted the ire of Queen Boadicea, who would go on to slaughter some 70,000 Romans on the Isle and anybody who had anything to do with them. She eradicated the Romans for some time out of the British Isles. Now, you might think that's just pure legend and nobody believes it anymore and everybody's kind of written out Boadicea as some fantasy somewhere. No. Right here, the picture you're seeing right here is a current statue of Queen Boadicea located at the edge of Hyde Park in downtown London, England. This is well accepted history that this is what happened with Boadicea, that she did in fact do this. Now, Boadicea died in 61 AD. And because she died in 61 AD, well, this tells you something. Now, we've got something that's going to happen here because remember that Paul, his ministry is not going to start until 48 AD. You can tell this by going back and looking at the record in Galatians. He talks about how 3 years after the crucifixion, the death, the resurrection, and ascension of Mashiach, he came back to Jerusalem to confront Kepha about the fact that Kepha was eating unclean foods. Apparently, Kepha had a couple of marshmallows, and there was rumor that he might have shared some bacon or shrimp or something. Anyway, there was something in this like going on, and Paul was confronting me. Hey, I saw you eating bacon with those Gentiles, up in Caesarea, and you come down here and try to pretend that you're eating only clean foods, right? And so this was the discussion that Paul has at the beginning of Galatians, but that happened 3 years after the ascension. And then Galatians chapter 2 tells you that Paul was then gone for 14 years. Well, I'm going to take off for 14 years and see if I can figure out what's going on, because he had to be trained up in everything. And he didn't anticipate his ministry for 14 years. Now, this puts his ministry beginning no earlier than 48 AD, no earlier than 48 AD. And by the time he comes into London to preach, we estimate this is between 62 and 64 BC, and he made 2 trips in between 62 and 64 BC. So he came in after the death of Boadicea. And of course, A'rama'thea was also gone, who died in 45 AD. So these, the standing stones were gone by the time Paul made his entry into London. And of course, this is well substantiated in the British record. You don't hear about it. People have complained about what's in the book of Acts in the Sefer, because we include Acts chapter 29, which completes the story and tells you that, in fact, Paul did these things, that Paul went into Spain and that Paul came into Britain, and then he left Britain and he went to the Sidus where Pontius Pilate had committed suicide and ended up back in Macedonia. And people have denied that, but the record is so replete. I mean, I saw volume on volume on volume on volume that reiterated that same narrative, that Paul had been there twice and that had been there between 62 and 64 BC, that he, in fact, had anointed 4 or 5 bishops in Sevilla and Cordoba, Spain. On and on and on the record goes. And so it's really quite replete. To try to deny what was in Acts 29, I think, is ludicrous. We have since proved it. As a matter of fact, there's enough of a record to say that's pretty conclusive. Now, in addition to that, the question is the question of the Druids. So the Druids come to Paul and say, we come from the same stock you do. Well, I've just shown you that the Druids were of the house of Zerach and the house of Peretz, who had joined together under the High Irish kings. And their practices were consistent with the Torah that had been brought into Ireland in 581 BC. So they weren't telling him a falsehood. They showed him, these are our rites, these are our rituals, this is what we do. And Paul said, yeah, I guess you guys are one of us. I guess we're related. And he gives them a kiss of peace. Well, we've had people burn the Sefer over this issue. But the truth is, that's the truth. If they were not Druids, like the New Age guys who run around hugging trees wearing a Roman wreath, these were the true Brehon. And they were the foundation pillars of the common law in the British Isles. All right, now we're going to drop into, just a second before we get out of here, I want to take a look at this narrative that concerns Yoceph A'rama'thea. Well, you might be asking yourself the question, why did A'rama'thea, the richest man in the world maybe, or one of the richest, who was also in the Sanhedrin, also in the Roman Senate, why would he leave Judea? Well, think about this for a minute. You've got a situation going on where Yoceph A'rama'thea, he and Nicodemus, who may have been his nephew, the two of them come in and they say to Pilate, we're here to get the body. We're here to get the body. And Pilate releases the body. To who? Does Pilate release the body to a rich man just because he wants the body? Maybe in the book Frankenstein, but I don't think that's the case. I think they all, under Roman law, they would have to release it only to the patriarch of the family. And who was the patriarch of the family? Well, he would be the father of Miryam, Yoceph A'rama'thea. So the body is released to him, and he puts the body in the tomb. Now, imagine the suspicion when the body is resurrected and they go to the tomb and can't find it. Hey, what happened to the body? Get Joseph. He's the one that put him in there. Get him. Well, it's even more suspect than that, because these Sanhedrin were absolutely fearful of the power of Mashiach. They were absolutely trembling at the power of Mashiach. So let's see what happens here. According to the narrative in Nicodemus, the Gospel of Nicodemus, also called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. This is published in our book Havot, available at the Sefer.net website. When the unjust Yahudim heard that Yosef had begged and buried the body of Yahusha, they sought after Nicodemus. And after those 15 men who had testified before the governor, Pilate, that Yahusha was not born through fornication and that other good persons who had showed any good actions toward him. They had one witness after another, non-related, who had testified as to the miracles and testified that he was not born through fornication. But when they had all concealed themselves, they wouldn't come forward anymore. Through the fear of the Yahudim, Nicodemus alone showed himself to them and said, how can such persons as these enter into this synagogue? The Yahudim answered him, but how dare you, who were a confederate with Mashiach, enter into this synagogue? Let your lot be along with him in the other world. And Nicodemus answered, amen, so may it be, that I may have my lot with him in his kingdom. This, by the way, this is after out of chapter 9 of Nicodemus. And in a like manner, Yoceph, that would be Yoceph A'rama'thea, when he came to the Yahudim, said to them, why are you angry with me for desiring the body of Yahusha of Pilate? Behold, I have put him in my tomb, wrapped him up in clean linen, and put a stone at the door of the sepulchre. I have acted rightly towards him, but you have acted unjustly against that just person in crucifying him, giving him vinegar to drink, crowning him with thorns, tearing his body with whips, and prayed down the guilt of his blood upon you. The Yahudim, at the hearing of this, were disquieted and troubled. So they seized Yosef and commanded him to be put in custody before the Sabbath and kept there until the Sabbath was over. Now, the question is, which Sabbath? Okay, they commanded him to be put in custody before the Sabbath and kept there until the Sabbath was over. Now, remember the timing on this. When we talk about Shabbat, and this, for those people who are not new to the feast, this is going to be kind of, I don't know, mumbo jumbo to you, but those who know the feast, I'm going to try to explain it. When you get to the Passover, the Pesach is the day of preparation. This is not a Sabbath because you're preparing. So you can work and you can make food and you can do this, and you can do the other thing. It is not a Sabbath. It is the day of preparation. The Torah provides that you are to have the Sabbath meal the evening before. That's when the lamb is supposed to be slaughtered. That's when you are supposed to be eating matzah and unleavened bread with your shoes on because you're going to be leaving in a hurry. This was correctly kept by Mashiach, who kept the Last Supper the evening before the day of preparation. But Mashiach would be crucified on the day of preparation, and they wanted to get it done before sundown because that would begin the feast of matzah or unleavened bread. And at sundown, that becomes a Hag. That is to say, a high Shabbat. And it's a high Shabbat that's even, more strict than the regular Shabbat. No servile work can be done at all whatsoever on the high Shabbat. However, that's not the Saturday Shabbat. That's not the seventh-day Shabbat. That is just the high Shabbat wherever matzah may land. And so then you come along to the Shabbat that is the regular Shabbat, and that would be what's called the first Shabbat, because that is going to begin the count of the Omer towards Shavuot, counting of the 7 weeks. And so when we talk about, by the time this is going down, when Nicodemus is being confronted in the synagogue, what is going on here? Okay, so this was sometime before the Saturday, but after the high Shabbat, when A'rama'thea had placed the body in the tomb. So they're saying, all right, well, look, if that's the case, we want to put you in custody before the Shabbat and kept there until after the Shabbat was over, because they were fearful that something was going to happen at the Shabbat. And also, they had planned to persecute him, not prosecute him, but persecute him after that Shabbat. They just couldn't do it during the Shabbat. And they said to him, make confession, for at this time it is not lawful to do you any harm until the first day of the week comes. Then we can execute you. But we know that you will not be thought worthy of a burial, but we will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. We're going to kill you and throw you out on the dirt like dung. This is what they're telling him, point blank. This is what they're telling him. We can't kill you right now because we're in the middle of the feast. We've got the Sabbath coming up. We can't do any servile work, including executing you. But we're going to execute you, and then we're going to throw your body out. You're not going in your own tomb. We're going to cast you out right on the dirt. How's that grab you? And Yoceph answered, that speech is like the speech of proud Goliath, who reproached the living Elohim in speaking against David. But you scribes and doctors know that Elohim said by the prophet, vengeance is mine, and I will repay to you evil equal to that which you have threatened to me. Yahushua, who you have hanged upon the cross, is able to deliver me out of your hands. All of your wickedness will return upon you. Oh, bingo. And the elders of the Yahudim, upon hearing these words, were exceedingly enraged and seized Yoceph. They put him into a chamber where there was no window. They fastened the door and put a seal on the lock. And Hananiah and Caiaphas placed a guard at it and took counsel with the priests and the Leviim that they should all meet after the Shabbat. And they conspired what death they should put Yoceph to. How are we going to kill him? I don't know. Maybe we could just shoot him with a 22. When they had done this, the rulers, Hananiah and Caiaphas, ordered Yoceph to be brought forth. But when they inquired of him, he was not to be found. Well, that's a bit of an issue now, isn't it? Okay. So I'm going to stop the share here. There we go. Okay. So you can see here that this is becoming a very interesting problem for the Sanhedrin. But you can also see that at this point, the Sanhedrin have made it very clear, we're going to kill you, Yoceph of A'rama'thea. We're going to kill you, and we're going to throw your body out in the trees somewhere where the birds can eat it. We're not even going to bury you. We're not going to allow anybody to bury you. This is one of the richest men in the world who sat on the Sanhedrin. And they've decided they're going to do this. Can you see the impetus and the reason why A'rama'thea would pack it up and leave and, in fact, go all the way to the British Isles to get completely clear of what was taking place in Yahud? Well, you can. All right. Now, I'm going to give just some introductory notes. And while I'm giving these introductory notes, I want to encourage you guys to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I'm sorry I couldn't monitor the chat during this thing. I just couldn't manage to get these screens going together here. So this is what we have. So if you've got questions, go ahead and put some questions up. But when we look at what happened here, the narrative is going to tell us that A'rama'thea would leave the 12 disciples. Who did he take with him? Well, he took Shimon the Zealot, who was probably Mashiach's brother. Ya'aqov Tsaddiq, James the Just, would remain at Qumran. Josephus probably came with him, the other brother. And of course, Jude would also remain in Judea. Okay, so with that being the case, now, also Miryam traveled with him. And Aristobulus V traveled with him, and others. And so here you see Yoceph A'rama'thea arriving in the British Isles with the intent to never return to Yahud. And when he gets there, he and the disciples and this narrative is readily accepted by the Brehon judges, by the Druids. They're going, oh yeah, we knew this. That's why we came to Bethlehem as the Magi and brought gifts, because we knew he was coming. We saw this in the stars. We saw the astronomy predict this. We saw the wonders in heaven, and we were able to bring it. And so when this happens, this becomes an explosive fire in the west of Britain, in Wales and in Cornwall. It becomes an explosive fire. And someone who was in control of the area then delivered to Yoceph of A'rama'thea 12 hides of land. Now, I spoke with Dr. Ian Jones at the museum in Wales when I was up there in March. And we talked about this a bit because we believe we found, of course, he believes that well, I shouldn't say he believes, but there is discussion that the bones of Miryam were repatriated into Wales and a new grave was formed for her and that they had located the tombstone. Now, is this verified? No, but right now it's speculation. But there is reason to believe that this was the case. And when I spoke with Ian, he believed that the 12 hides of land were on Anglesey, and rather than down in Cardiff, they were up on Anglesey. And because at the time that A'rama'thea was there, Cardiff was not the capital of Wales. The capital of Wales was up at a place called Waxeter, I think the name of it is, to the east of Birmingham. It's more in central Wales. And but Anglesey is this place that was a place of refuge because of the Straits of Menai. The Straits of Menai are very difficult crossing. It's super bad mud with high tides. And I think there's 1 or 2 times a year they could actually cross the Straits of Menai with cattle and so forth. And so Bangor is the uncrossed side of the Straits of Menai. Anglesey would be across that strait from Bangor, where the massacre occurred. So it's very possible that A'rama'thea had his 12 hides of land on Anglesey. And at any rate, you can see that this fire would catch. And when this fire caught in the British Isles, it became very, very strong, very, very powerful, it became a dominant faith in the Isles that Rome has forever sought to extinguish. They have forever sought to extinguish. Okay? Now, I spoke a little bit about this on RFA earlier today. If you get a chance to pick up that discussion on Radio Free Alaska on the Telegram channel, I have some kind of introductory remarks also to this particular presentation, discussing how the line of kings continued all the way to Robert the Bruce, who was the brother of Edward the Bruce, the last Irish High King. Robert the Bruce was then, yes, I can. So Braden asked the question, can you explain the teaching that Joachim was the father of Mary? Well, when you talk about the name Joachim, Yoses, Yoceph, Yahuseph, these are all names that were kind of similar. But when you look at the Gospel of Nicodemus or the Gospel of Ya'aqov, they want to use the name Joachim. And part of that was to distinguish between the father of Miryam and the husband of Miryam. However, remember that one of the great secrets that had to be kept from everyone in the world that no one could know was that Yoceph A'rama'thea was in the line of kings and was the grandfather of Mashiach. This could not be known. Rome could not allow this to be known. So as a consequence, any literature that explained that it was Yoceph A'rama'thea had to be rewritten in Latin to describe that. That's why you read Joachim. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Let's see. What are my thoughts regarding the historical research of Wilson and Blackett? I think Wilson and Blackett, I disagree with Alan Wilson in the respect that his faith journey was not quite there, and he did not regard Scripture as a source of historical reference. Had he regarded Scripture the way I regarded it, I think he would have found many things that would click in place. But Alan Wilson's research, I think, is outstanding, and I think Barnum Blackett was outstanding. I think Ross Broadstock as a mentor, being mentored by them, and also Shane Stokes, who have been following up on this. We take a high risk. Those gentlemen take high risks in asserting the historical record the way they do, because again, the New World Order, if you will, the powers that be, the House of Esau, does not want this information on the table. They do not want this information out. Now, Alan Wilson, I was at St. Peter's Church in Wales at the invitation of Ross Broadstock. We walked into the church, the place where King Arthur II was buried, and where Alan Wilson found the grave of a 6-foot man inside this church who had a cross on his chest that spelled Arthur. So, think whatever you want, but the historical record showed that 1,000 people had come to that church for the funeral of Arthur II, who had actually been murdered in America. He'd been murdered in America. And again, I don't want to get too far into this, but when you start talking about Madog, the prince who had got lost and found the St. Lawrence waterway, and he would report back to Arthur, and they would bring 70 ships following a major comet that had destroyed basically the British Isles for 10 years. Arthur would save his people by taking them on 70 ships into North America. And many of those people remained behind, and some of the tribes that were found up around the Great Lakes had red hair and spoke Welsh. And in addition to that, Cobra language was found in many of the mounds that were found in Ohio, in Indiana, and northern Kentucky. They thought it was initially the Hebrew paleoglyphs, but it was not Paleo-Ivrit. Alan Wilson looked at it, and the difference between the Paleo-Ivrit and the Qumran language is there were additional letters in the Qumran. So if you find any of those additional letters, it's Qumran and not Paleo-Hebrew. And that's what Alan Wilson determined when he came into Kentucky to look this over. So Ashton writes, okay, the Qumran Bible was mentioned in chat and discussed as supporting this. Qumran does not seem to be a Bible, and perhaps a late text claiming ancient origins. Is the Qumran of any value? Yeah, the Qumran is of value. However, I have to warn you against the Qumran, because in this respect, I think the first part of the Qumran is actually, fabricated. They claim to have the same kind of story that Joseph Smith had, that there were discs that they found, and they wrote out these discs, and it basically gives a story of evolution, and on and on and on and on. But you remember, there's many ancient writings in the Qumran. When you start getting towards the back half of the book, I do think that those are true texts. When you get to what's called the Koel book, that is in the back half of the Qumran, and Koel was Old King Cole, right? Old King Cole was a merry old soul. Old King Koel was the progenitor of Bran the Blessed. Bran the Blessed would marry the sister of Miryam, the daughter of Yoceph A'rama'thea, and the bloodline of David would continue in the kings from that point forward, okay? So when you read the Qumran, you have to understand that some of it is much more credible than the other portions of it. The very end of the Qumran is absolutely unbelievable, because it talks about the kind of events that happened in Mitzrayim at the time of the Exodus. And it's absolutely a fascinating read. Absolutely a fascinating read. Okay, let's see. Hey, I want to thank you guys. Thanks, Debbie, and thank you, Braden, and thank you, Joshua, and thanks, Ashton, and Ron Elson. I'm glad you're here. Ron Holsey, Sherry Papin, Maria Jensen. I'm just glad you guys are here. And Barbara, thank you for being a part of this subscription group, and thank you for being here and giving us some feedback. Okay, so Ron says, sounds like a good story. Well, it is a story, but you have to keep in mind this. When we start looking at the ancient record, you start going back to say, let's go find what's there 2,000 years ago. And you walk into a graveyard in Wales that has gravestones that were carved in the 1700s, and the rain has washed 100% of the way of the carving off the face of that stone. You get a very clear idea how quickly the rain can completely destroy an ancient record, okay? Can completely destroy it. So when you look at these ancient records, how do you find the truth of the record? Well, there's some truth in mythology. And that's just, we're taught this is all mythology. Well, it's all in the context of how the mythology is presented. But when you see multiple societies giving you the same myth, like the myth of Noah's flood, for instance, that's in practically every culture on earth. Well, when you start seeing multiple cultures giving the same story in different languages that didn't know each other, you can come to the conclusion that that likely did happen. Just as the story of the fall of the Titans in the Greek record, which is also a civil war explained in the Hindu record, which is also explained in the Egyptian record, which is also explained in the biblical record. Well, that's 4 different records that have nothing to do with each other that appeared to be in context. Also, Gamaliel did fit into this relation with Yoceph A'rama'thea. In fact, Gamaliel is mentioned in the Gospel of Nicodemus. When it comes time for them to find Yoceph, they do in fact find him after he had escaped the tomb. And they say, hey, Joseph, we were just kidding about killing you. Could you come back in and talk to us? And so he does go back in to talk to him, and then he leaves, and then he gets out. Now, also, when you talk about the 13 witnesses that came and testified to the miracles, when you read the Ascents of James, which appears in the Clementine homilies, but it is also a separate text. And in fact, one of the most authoritative texts of the first century that there is, you see the 12 disciples testifying in front of I forget who was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time, but Caiaphas. They gave him nothing but a ration of grief, and they destroyed him on 12 different premises. 12 witnesses testifying, 15 witnesses testifying to the miracles. You see, and so all of this is here. So now, I want to give you a little bit of the prelude. Yeah, now Sharon Pratt asks, is that the same for the Bat Creek stone in the Paleo-Hebrew? Yeah, the Bat Creek stone is, even though it appears to be Paleo-Hebrew, is more likely Qumran. There were 2 languages that are very similar to the Qumran. One is the Etruscan alphabet and the Qumran alphabet. Very similar. They have the 22 letters of the Paleo and additional letters. Okay, so it's the evidence of the additional letters that gives credence to the idea that this was not Paleo-Hebrew, but rather Qumran that had come in with the Welsh people. They weren't called Welsh at that time, Milesian people, who had come in the St. Lawrence waterway in the 6th century, at least 2 centuries ahead of the Vikings. Okay, all right. Now, let me give you a there you go, and thank you, Ronald. I agree. Mythology should be studied in any case. Is not a myth. Yeah, It's a form of the study. It's a form of the narrative. There's facts there that have to be addressed. The context of those facts may be kind of warped or twisted or whatever because of the people not understanding the fullness of it. But nonetheless, they're there. Somebody asked me if I've read the Gospel of the Caled. I can't say. Yeah, if it's part of the Qumran that I've read it. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Do I think there's a connection of the Irish to the Hyksos pharaohs? That's coming from Blackie. Now, I can tell you the Hyksos, Blackie, I'm going to say this. The Hyksos, I believe, are the house of Yasharel. Okay. When you look at the history of the Hyksos people, you can see that the pharaoh was at the time Ma'ibri Shishi, which I believe is Joseph. From the Hebrews, such a man. Ma'ibri Shishi. This was Joseph. He reigned for 30 years before the Hyksos came in, and they came in by invitation, according to the Egyptian record, and were expelled around 1500 BC. And so the 1500 BC expulsion, 1499 BC to be exact, the expulsion of the Hyksos people then appears to be very contemporaneous with, in fact, the exodus of Moshe. So when we talk about the Irish in connection to the Hyksos, there is a connection in this respect, that you have this house of Zerach, and the house of Zerach actually retains to some degree in Egypt, because the house of Zerach remember that Zerach was cast into the wilderness as the Azazel goat. He had the red ribbon. He was cast into the wilderness. And so when you read scripture, they don't want to talk about Zerach. And they don't want to talk about his kids. In fact, you look at 1 Chronicles 5:1. The genealogy is not to be reckoned. When you see Zerach, his children, Calcol, likely the founder of Athens, Darda or Dardanus, the founder of Troy, Haman, who would go up into Bulgaria and found what were called the Firbolgs, who did in fact inhabit Ireland. The Firbolgs did in fact inhabit Ireland initially. And Ethan, who would form the city of Carthage and the city of Cadiz, Spain. Cadiz, Spain. And then, of course, Gaialetus, who was a grandson of Calcol, would then bring the house of Zerach back into Egypt at the time later on. In a different century, Gaialetus comes back at the time that the pharaoh was Seti I, Ramesses I, Ramesses II, and so on. These pharaohs were the children of Asu. The Idumean kingdom had been conquered by the Mitzrayim after the Hyksos had left. The Idumean kingdom had been conquered by the Mitzrayim, and once they were conquered, they then usurped the throne of Egypt and took over the seat of Pharaoh, beginning with Seti I. This is according to Charles A.L. Tott. And so what the house of Zerach was then in direct interface with this house of Asu in Egypt or in Mitzrayim. And so from here, you can see that what takes place is Gaialetus then leaves and he migrates across to Morocco and then into Celtic Iberia, into the area of Lusitania, which they would name a port after Gaialetus called Portugal. And Gauls would then form along the Lusitanian coast, the northern coast of Spain, the western coast of France, and then up into Cornwall, up into Wales, up into Ireland, and even up into Scotland. So this is where you get the house of Zerach, even though when they're talked about when they're talked about their initial discussion in Ireland, they're called the Firbolgs or the Bulgars, the Bulgarians, the Bulgars, right? And so Jessica said, would Gamaliel fit into relation to Joseph of A'rama'thea and Nicodemus? No, Gamaliel is not in part of that family. No, he's not part of that family. And I'll try to get some more information on Nikom ben Gorion, which was Nicodemus. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, I asked because most are said to be descendants of Princess Skoda, who is said to be the daughter of Pharaoh. Yeah, but Princess Skoda was actually, if you read the literature inside of Ireland, there is some literature that refers to Skoda not as the daughter of Pharaoh, although some do, but rather Skoda being the other sister of Zedekiah. And so that's what it looked like. Okay, let's see. So Ron, cheap shot. Ron Elson. Yeah, hey, John. Okay, Ron. I don't know. You got Ronnie cheap shot. I get it must be from your college athletics there. Who was it Yahshua was referring to on the cross as forsaking him or not being there? Yeah. Great question, Ron. And in this case, when you see this question, Eli, Eli, why have you forsaken me? No, the prophecy says he did not cry out, and yet it appears he cried out. Well, who was he crying out to? I don't think he was crying out to Yahweh, that he would have referred to as Avi, not Eli. He was talking about his grandfather through Yosef, his supposed father, who you read in your average Bible, it says Heli, but whose name was actually Eli. Eli, Eli, why are you not here? Why are you not here? Why is my family here, but you are not here? Eli, Eli. Now, it's also discussed that Eli was one of those who traveled with Yoceph A'rama'thea into Britain. Okay. All right. Let's see. The Welsh tutors were likely aware of the tomb pilgrimage. How was Henry VIII burning motivated by his divorce rebellion from the RCC and Venetian agents in his court? Oh, yeah. You could see the Venetian agents in the court. Of course, the Venetian agents are something else again, too. Who were the Venetians? That's another big question. And when you see what was going on with Henry VIII, there was a great deal of political intrigue going on, including from Anne Boleyn. Everybody thinks he just beheaded her because he wanted to get remarried. There was political intrigue going on with Anne Boleyn in a big way. And and Henry didn't get completely divorced from the RCC. And of course, yes, anybody who was giving him grief, he was burning them down. And he just said, I'm changing all this because, of course, Rome was making laws that was encroaching on the common law. They initially said, we're just going to settle matters ecclesiastical. If a priest offends, then we'll handle the priest. If something goes on in the church, we'll handle that offense. But we'll mind our own business concerning what goes on in Britain. Pretty soon, the courts ecclesiastical were overruling the courts of Britain. And when that happened, Henry VIII said, no, we're not doing this anymore. Rome is not going to give us a one-size-fit-all shoe from the EU telling the people in Britain what to do. And so they bounced them out. And that began the story of freedom that has given us the freedom to form the nation of America. People should not forget that, right? That there's a lot more to this than what meets the eye. Okay, now I'm going to stop for just 1 second and say this to you. When we talk about, there's going to be a part 2 to this next week. And we're going to discuss what were the practices of Yoceph A'rama'thea in Britain and how were they distinguishable from Ya'aqov Tsaddiq, James the Just, and the practices in Qumran and the community rules and the discussion that takes place in Acts chapter 2. Because A'rama'thea is going to give life to something completely different than what we see going on in Judea. And this difference is night and day for the people of the Commonwealth, from the people of the common law, for the people of common sense. And it is extremely important because A'rama'thea is much more consistent with the edicts of the 10 Devarim than was Ya'aqov Tsaddiq. Remember, Ya'aqov Tsaddiq, Yaakov the humble, Yaakov the meek, and he would require this kind of meekness to be practiced at Qumran. When you read the community rules, you'll see what I'm talking about. You compare this, on the other hand, to what was going on with A'rama'thea, who had accepted 12 hides of land in Britain. What a difference that makes. Because, of course, of the foundations that are laid in the 10 Devarim. And if you leave the 10 Devarim behind, then you will be living under the community rules of the collective. And believe me, when we talk about the politics in this world, it is all somewhere along the continuum between hyper-individualism and hyper-collectivism. And somewhere in there is the correct path to follow scripturally. And we're going to talk about what that is next week. We'll go into the practices of the A'rama'thean Remnant. Okay. All right. So I want to thank you guys. Thank you for being a part of this ministry. Thank you for being here, subscribers. Thank you, people who are joining us for the first time on this channel. I hope I did not spend too much time on the preliminary remarks, but got to the point of the discussion as quickly as I could so that we could talk about these preliminary this preamble, if you will, in setting the foundation for understanding A'rama'thea and the remnant. Next week, we're going to pick this up again, and we're going to deal with the practices of the A'rama'thean remnant. Okay, thank you, Jessica Knock, for administrating here tonight. Thank you all in the chat for being here. And remember, join me on the Telegram channel at Radio Free Alaska, or the Sefer Shabbat group, or the World Assembly of Yahweh. And you can also catch me at Stephen Pigeon Chat. Also, don't forget to visit us at the Sefer website, sefer.net, where we have 300 videos up, and we have an additional 400 blogs. And there are many podcasts available as a resource under Sefer Radio on the website. So if you're a podcaster, there's hundreds of podcasts that you can hear on the Sefer Radio podcast site available through sefer.net. If you'd like additional teaching, or more specifically, join us at Sefer Academy. Sandy Blair, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Yes, it is an extension that we covered in the Best Rock class. Yeah, and it's going to be much more detailed. And I want to say this before I go too. You know, I feel a real pressing need to be able to share this with you, because we're coming to a point, and we're coming to a point very quickly, where the world is going to be looking a lot different than what it looks like right now. I believe there's going to be a lot of stress placed on Western society, and in particular on American society, over the next several years. And in that, we want to be the light that says, we are the light at the end of the tunnel. These are the ancient practices and the ancient ways that brought us to a place of life, and life more abundantly. Would you like to return to that? And if we can make that understanding, then we have grounds to speak. And if we are going to speak, we need to know what we're going to say. Okay, blessings and Bavakasha, Rick Johnson. Thank you so much. And we will see you again next week.